I'm James Patrick, the director of Big Picture. In this interview with David Webb, we go a bit deeper into the mechanics of the Great Taking. In the wake of the financial crisis in 2008, financial authorities called for the creation of central clearing counterparties to clear all derivatives contracts in the market, eliminating two counterparties on each contract. The central clearing counterparty became the counterparty to all contracts. By centralizing all clearance, this creates a monolithic risk and a monolithic vulnerability. In this interview, he also discusses the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy decision and efforts on the state level to amend Article 8 of the UCC that are underway. Enjoy.
The very important thing to know is that central clearing counterparties really didn't exist early on in the derivatives bubble and phenomena. All these contracts were bilateral. There was a party on each side. They were negotiated contracts, so you had to have someone to take the other side. They had collateral at risk. So that in and of itself is a kind of stabilizer. And for every winner, there was a loser. So there was an inherent kind of stability in the system. The bubble that was blown up was enormous that was occurring because they were using the client collateral, this pooled collateral under these trades, but still there was a marketplace and these were bilateral contracts. Perhaps the greatest purpose of the financial crisis in 2008-2009 was to establish an imperative to centrally clear derivatives. And there was just an assertion that was never really examined, never challenged, that bilateral contracts were risky, to have arm's length contracts between parties, and because your counterparty could fail. So you had to have central clearing counterparties. And so this is when this began. After that crisis, and there might be 20 of them globally. It's not like there's a single central clearing counterparty. The Depository Trust Corp operates two of the largest factors in this as central clearing counterparties. What that does is it concentrates all the risk of the derivatives complex in these central clearing counterparties. So the central clearing counterparty is your counterparty. Now, this was done in the name of safety, but what happens if the central clearing counterparty fails? Then you have no counterparty.
All counterparties go down, right?
Well, there could be a conflagration, let's say, where the collapse would ripple through, and
which wouldn't occur if you just had.
Which wouldn't have happened if you had you couldn't have had a systemic collapse if you had this distributed risk of bilateral contracts. Now, sure, you could have certain of the biggest banks that would have big exposure, but this has created a monolithic vulnerability in these central clearing counterparties, and the participants in the industry at a high level have been discussing for a number of years the prospect of failure of central clearing counterparties, and that can occur with the failure of one major clearing member. And a clearing member is basically one big brokerage firm or bank. I think they were clearly set up to concentrate the risk and create a monolithic vulnerability. There's no benign explanation for it to take a system that could have inherent stability and to create a monolithic vulnerability. Now, there's also an asymmetry to that vulnerability. When I say that, if you have a contract and your counterparty is the central clearing counterparty, and if the central clearing counterparty fails, you have no party to honor that contract. That is true for your pension fund, for any even very large, sophisticated players that may have hedged their risk of a market decline, so that as the market is declining, they are more and more in the money on those contracts, offsetting the losses on their long positions. So they believe they're okay, they did the right thing, they would have been protected, but now there's no counterparty behind the contracts that would have offset their other losses. So now they've failed. Now they're insolvent. However, the very biggest banks are protected. They are the protected class that will take collateral behind their contracts when the central clearing counterparties fail. You see, your pension fund is not in the protected class and will not be able to take the collateral behind the derivatives contract. It's only the biggest banks that can do that. So that is the reason to create the monolithic vulnerability and the asymmetry. They had to have this asymmetry where only the biggest banks have the power to be protected. The central clearing counterparties are where all derivative contracts are cleared. The risk of all derivatives are on the balance sheet of the central clearing counterparties. The term protected class was used in the Lehman judgment. Okay, so we have it in black and white. 5 years after the failure of Lehman Brothers, and very large, sophisticated institutional investors, unbeknownst to them, their collateral, mainly Treasury securities, which was their capital base, their dry powder that underpins all of their trades, all of their positions, their collateral was being used by Lehman Brothers under swap contracts to finance Lehman Brothers. Now, that is something that happens really all the time everywhere. What Lehman was doing was not unusual. It was not just because of the bankruptcy. This is what goes on all the time. And so the clients would never have known that unless there had been an insolvency. That's when this matters. So the client assets are being used, but in the event of insolvency, the clients do not have the ability to revindicate or take back their property because it is legally owned by the secured creditors of the intermediary. Lehman was using the client treasury securities mainly under swap contracts, and JP Morgan was the custodian for the client assets, so knew this was happening and that these were client assets. Meanwhile, JP Morgan was the counterparty on the swap contracts that took the client assets in the bankruptcy immediately. So 5 years later, these institutions, if they were still in business, were trying to get their securities back or be made whole, and the bankruptcy court in the Southern District of New York, which is Manhattan, found in favor of JP Morgan, that JP Morgan was able to take the client assets. In other words, they would not be returned. The judge said the only question, he said this is exactly the situation in which the safe harbors apply. Safe harbors mean safe harbor for the secured creditors to keep the client assets. Previous to this, what Lehman had done and what JP Morgan had done would have been a constructively fraudulent transfer. That these assets left the bankruptcy estate, had been transferred essentially on the eve of the bankruptcy to an insider, which JP Morgan clearly was as the custodian for the client assets. So it rang every bell as having been fraud, which it is. It's called constructive fraud because you could just see it on the face of it that it's fraud. So the judge said, nope, safe harbors apply here because they were designed to protect the largest financial institutions in a time of crisis. And the only question is whether JP Morgan is entitled under safe harbors to this protection. And then the judge wrote, JP Morgan is quite obviously a member of the protected class, quote unquote, as one of the world's largest banks is quite obviously a member of the protected class.
Most people have heard of that in the too big to fail bank. Is that?
It's the same thing.
So systemically important financial.
Yeah, or the other acronym is GSIB, Globally Systemically Important Bank. The idea of protecting the biggest banks was being worked on prior to the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and that gave rise to the implementation of safe harbor changes in U.S. bankruptcy law to protect the biggest banks. So you hear all these terms, too big to fail, globally systemically important banks. They're the same thing. The protected class, it's the same thing. It is the biggest banks. You heard a lot of that explanation or exposition during that financial crisis, that was the imperative to protect the biggest banks. And, you and I know this was being unpackaged and explained by James S. Rogers in 1996. The Armageddon planning to basically sweep the collateral to the biggest banks, particularly in a crisis. So this has been planned for decades. And that Lehman Brothers case was really cemented the case law behind this, but also was used as the imperative to centrally clear all the derivatives. That was the last piece that was not yet in place. So it took upwards of 10 years to get all that in place, to establish the central clearing counterparties. Their own documents around this explained that there was no market need for the central clearing. There was no shortage of collateral, but by regulatory fiat, they mandated the central clearing and the imperative to have more collateral in the central clearing counterparties. So this was regulatory fiat. It was driven by regulation. It was not driven by needs of market participants. There was no shortage of collateral. They drove this requirement to establish the central clearing counterparties, clear all the derivatives through them, and to sweep collateral to the central clearing counterparties. It's in the book. It's in the book that participants are saying, there's no shortage of collateral right now, but we're doing this because of regulation. I think you can see it explained, again, in policy perspectives.
Yeah.
They knew as far back as that. I wouldn't call it a class system per se. It's more like a military hybrid war strategy. Yes, there will be a tiny, tiny group of people that are controlling everything, but it's more like a military strategy. the shocking thing is the level of the participation. So including the president of the New York Fed, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Secretary, the head of the FDIC. This is highly unusual. You would never see anything like that, but they do it every year. And it's trilateral in that it is Britain, Europe, and the US, the biggest financial centers. And it's specifically about cross-border mobility of the collateral. And these are continuing. So when I wrote the book, I noted that it was something like 7 out of the past 8 years they had done this, and they may have missed a year because of COVID, but now they've continued with those the last couple of years. So they're that is showing that this is geopolitical in nature. It doesn't even require conjecture. You look at their own statements. DTCC, supposedly they've done all of this resiliency planning, but by their own admission, they state that they have reached the conclusion they will not put more capital at risk, because that would be the capital of their members, and their interests are aligned with their members. So they have made the decision that what makes sense is to pre-fund the startup of a new central clearing counterparty if one of theirs fails. And this is said more than once, that we think that is the thing to do, to pre-fund a central clearing counterparty. Now, what does that mean? It means that the pension fund will not have a counterparty behind its hedging, but that when it becomes insolvent, the collateral in these pools behind the contracts will be taken by who? Only the biggest banks are in the protected class to take the collateral out of the bankruptcy. So this is how it works. You have and there was a Financial Stability Board document, part of the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, December of 23. Mm-hmm. About the effect of margin, the risk of margin spirals, and what will happen in that. And a margin spiral is when the markets are falling, there will be a call for more collateral, which forces more selling to come up with the collateral, which actually forces markets lower. And so a collapse can be driven in this way, but where is the collateral going? We know from the 2014 document, also BIS document about the collateral, advances in collateral management, that there is an automated system that will automatically sweep the collateral to the central clearing counterparties in a crisis. No human intervention. It's plumbed globally for that. Again, this is not conjecture. It's black and white in their own document. The document about the margin spirals from 2023, December, explains that normally you have initial margin. Now think of that like a margin account you'd have that you would buy stocks in personally, and your positions fall in value, and so you have to put more money into the account or you'll be stopped out. Your account will be liquidated. That's the way a margin account works. That's the way these contracts work. So you post, these derivatives are based on the movement of something. A price level in something. If it's moving in your favor, the other party has to post more collateral. If it's moving against you, you have to post more collateral.
Is
And
it an instantaneous thing, or like how
no, when they're
closing day, or
well, for the I would say for normal for a participant like a pension fund that has established a contract, they are going to receive a message that they have to post more collateral, or they'll lose their position. They'll be stopped out of that position. But for the complex as a whole, it is automated. The way this works, now imagine it this way: the market is falling and your pension fund is more and more in the money on their derivatives that would have hedged the decline. So they have long positions that are falling in value, but they've correctly offset that risk with derivatives contracts that pay more as the market falls. Now, more and more collateral is called for and swept to the central clearing counterparty, which is their counterparty behind that contract. And that is coming from these pools. Now, going back to this document about the margin spirals, normally its initial margin is cash and high-quality government bonds, treasuries. This is why treasuries, the chain of reuse, rehypothecation, is estimated to be 75 times over the same collateral is being used, because it's normally the easiest thing to use as collateral. But these BIS documents have explained, first in the 2014 document, that collateral transformation, that in a crisis, there won't be enough cash and government bonds. So everything will have to be used. So that through collateral transformation, you're taking something like a pool of equities and using that as collateral, but with a big haircut on the value of the equities.
so when someone buys a treasury thinking it's more secure, it's actually being used
It's being used many times over.
more than a GameStop stock.
Yes, it is. It is.
So could you say that in your sentence? I don't have a mic on.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
someone buys
treasury. Yeah. The irony is that if you're owning treasuries thinking that makes you safer, those are the instruments that are being used the most, many times over, through a very attenuated chain of hypothecation and rehypothecation. Equities may be used. They also have multiple claimants, so you're at risk with equities as well. But in this Armageddon planning, the intent is to use all of it. Okay, so the 2014 document on advances in collateral management explains that through collateral transformation, equities will be used. The December 23 document on margin spirals, so it talks about initial margin. Secondly, something called a collateral fund, and that the purpose of the collateral fund is to mutualize losses. They say that. The collateral fund, there's a litany of all kinds of instruments in the collateral fund, including equities. Gets swept to the central clearing counterparty, which is the counterparty on all of these derivatives contracts that, let's say, are going against the central clearing counterparty as the markets are falling. Now, the other aspect of this is that the major members, of the central clearing counterparty, which are the biggest banks and also smaller intermediaries, have an ability to cause the central clearing counterparty to take the opposite side on their derivatives. They control the entity. So they can know when a collapse is coming. They can cause the counterparty to take the other side on whatever contracts they intend to take out. And as the markets are falling, more and more collateral is swept behind their contracts into the central clearing counterparty to back their contracts. Now, what's the difference? The pension fund will not be able to collect because they're not in the protected class. You know, an insurance company, your retirement funds, your local banks, you know, the institutions in your state. It is only the globally systemically important banks that will collect the collateral that has been swept on a massive scale in the collapse behind their contracts. That is where it's going. Can people protect themselves by buying stock of the too big to fail banks? I had a friend and client who had run a regional investment bank, and I remember when we were in the last financial crisis, his strategy was to hide at JP Morgan, which of course worked at that time. And he said to me, they're not going to be the first bank to fail, which is absolutely true. Absolutely true. These major corporations are like a battleship. You know, there are chambers that are designed to be watertight. And so you have a holding company structure and you have subsidiaries under that. And the purpose of that structure is that you have subsidiaries that can be separately bankrupted. Meanwhile, the ship goes sailing on. So you do that by separating liability exposures in one subsidiary from other areas that hold the good assets that are going to survive. So I know that it would, with a major entity, it would take weeks and perhaps months of work with a legal team inside of the company to understand that structure within a company. That's working inside the company. I've done this kind of thing. So you can't know from the outside, impossible. But there are some hints, which is that the deposit-taking entities were, the Fed gave, I think it's Section 20A exemptions for the banks to move their derivatives books into their deposit-taking entities in the last financial crisis. So they didn't, and this was the Fed demonstrating this and encouraging them to do this. And this was done in a large number of banks.
And what is that time?
So you see an intent to move liabilities into the deposit-taking entities to expose. So they demonstrated they could do it, and they will do it. So that's been done. That tells you that thinking that you're hiding your cash in the deposit-taking entity, a Bank of America, which did this, JP Morgan, which did this, that you're going to be protected. We already have demonstration that that is not the case. We can also see that they're not shy about using client assets, even when they have been the custodian for the client assets. Again, writing on the wall there. So as I say, the intent of this is for the biggest banks to survive, but it's portions of the biggest banks.
So in a word, do you think the collateral gets swept up through the too big to fail banks through?
There will be some, it is engineered, there are portions of the banks that will take the assets, the public face, they've already demonstrated it, the public facing entities can be made to fail, not just allowed to fail, made to fail. If the intention, what I've tried to demonstrate here is that there's an intent here to take to take money and financial resources from the public. It's not a matter of greed. People ascribe this to greed. They already have unlimited money. The intention is that the public will have no recourse, no means. It's about subjugation. That's why this is not really about theft. It's not really about ordinary criminality. This is, and it's not about greed. This is a hybrid war strategy. It is about subjugation. So it's not that they need your stuff. It's that they do not want you to have your stuff. If they're really thinking this through, and we have every indication they are really thinking this through, the holding company could even be bankrupted. So even if you think you're going to piggyback by being in the stock of JP Morgan, that the holding company could be bankrupted, it's not an impossibility. Getting this bill done in a state, what that does is it creates a venue, a place where it is possible for investors to have priority to their own assets. But that does not happen instantly just by passing the bill. What would then have to happen is that investors demand that their contracts with their brokers and intermediaries are under that state's law. So it doesn't happen automatically. It's a place of law issue. So the way contracts have been written, the place of law is in the U.S. will most likely be New York. So it's under New York law, and those contracts would still be in place. It will be up to people that have the force to do so to demand that their contracts are under the state law, let's say Tennessee. This is done in Tennessee. So who would have an interest in doing that? The treasurer of the state would have the power to do that, to protect state funds, pension funds in the state. What this means is that the biggest, most sophisticated institutions and investors will drive the process from that point. They will have the clout to do that. That's how the change will come about. The banking lobby creates the impression if this is passed, all investment contracts will suddenly be invalid and it will create chaos. That is not the case. Actually, nothing changes to begin with. They did this in Tennessee. It will then be driven by, I believe, large, sophisticated investors that understand this. It will also bring investors globally to that venue that understand this, that will want their investment contracts to be under, let's say if Tennessee does this, under the law of Tennessee. It will be driven by the demand of large, sophisticated players that understand this. I think it's a very practical way to do it.
So the striking the exceptions would lead to a flocking of contracts or capital
Capital would come to the state.
for the
Yes.
brokerage accounts to be booked there.
It's a matter of the contract. You see, it's a matter of the contract signed has to be, the place of law has to be this under that state's law.
So this is between the client and the broker. Now the securities are still kept up in.
Nothing would change in the plumbing of the system. That's why this is a very conservative way to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing would change. There shouldn't be any panic. Everything continues to operate as it has. We are not in a financial collapse, so that actually there is no sweeping of collateral occurring at this time.
When the banking lobby comes and says, "Oh, this is going to create a problem," then you could articulate that a little more. This is a very conservative way to do this.
Yes.
There's really nothing to fear here.
The banking lobby will say, and have said, if this legislation is passed, this model bill, that it will be very bad for the state. It will create all kinds of problems. All contracts will have to be rewritten. There's a truth in that. The issue is that contracts can set the place of law. So day one, when the bill is signed, all the contracts still have the place of law set in New York. It is then incumbent upon the investors to get a new contract with the place of law set in Tennessee or whatever state implements the law. Wouldn't change anything immediately. And now what will drive that? It's probably not going to be an individual with their IRA that is going to be able to renegotiate their contract. It's going to be driven by the biggest, most sophisticated investors. And that's what we want. We need those people to then drive this, and they will. Once they have the ability to have this priority to their own investments in that state, the treasurer of the state needs to face up to that to protect the state's finances, the pension plans in the state. It will be driven from the state governmental level, and it will be driven by the biggest financial institutions in the state. And it will increasingly come from people all over the world that are sophisticated large investors that want their custody agreement under the law of that state. That's what will drive it. So we will finally have very powerful players working directly on this with us.